Stars
Podcast. This is the
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
That's right. It is indeed the Five Starr Wrestling Report podcast. And boy, do we have a packed one for today. I'm going to be talking about AEW Dynamite and continuing along in our retro review series of NWA World Championship Wrestling post Starrcade 85. And continuing along with World Class Championship Wrestling of 1982. And of course, we will get to all of that content in a minute. Before we do, as always, welcome aboard to the show, new and returning viewers. If it is your first time watching, make sure you smash the subscribe button, give the show a like for me, and most importantly, make sure you leave a comment down below regarding any or all material discussed in today's episode. We are here each Monday and Friday bringing you 2 weekly shows covering recaps on AEW, NWA, pay-per-view events, and news articles. As always, you can check the description box for links on my Chairshot content, as well as getting the link to find the show on Rumble. Definitely want to roll things along here because my voice always tends to give out by the time we get to the retro content, so let's dive into the coverage, starting with AEW Dynamite from December 1st, 2021, which was quite the show. Best wishes to JR in his ongoing radiation treatment for his skin cancer. And one of the things that they're going to be battling with over the next month or so is trying to find a third man to fill the commentary booth, which, I mean, I've been on a rant about the 3-man booth for a long time now, but, at this point, it's like beating a dead horse. For some reason, AEW feels that they need to have 3 people covering action at a given time, and God, if they can manage it, sometimes they'll even have 4 people out there, which is way too many goddamn people. But one of the running themes for the night was having several of the boys clocking in and out on color, which, wasn't a bad thing. Again, though, I still don't understand why they feel it's absolutely crucial they need a 3-man commentary booth. And, well, I think I partially know the answer to it in the back of my head. The answer is Excalibur is a horrible play-by-play guy, and Tony Schiavone has always kind of been better as the interjection type announcer, where he's not constantly trying to drown you out with verbiage. And, this was actually something I covered in my Starrcade review earlier in the week. Talking about how I kind of missed the days where wrestling commentary just felt like natural discussion of a match instead of the whole WWE pomp and circumstance. Oh, we have to constantly have exciting, over-the-top commentary from start to finish. You really don't. I actually prefer the periods in matches where there's silence, so I can actually watch guys work instead of having to hear guys constantly talking over stuff. Of course, nowadays with guys blatantly calling spots during matches, it's kind of hard to cover up for that. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked here. Opening match was Bryan Danielson taking on generic bald jobber number 108. By the way, I cannot be alone in thinking this. Is the Dark Order theme not among the worst tracks in all of AEW right now? The Best Friends music was pretty bad, but at least that one had some sort of melodic line. The Dark Order music is just streamlined grunting and overlaying chants. So bad. The match was a match. not a bad one or anything, but nothing all that noteworthy to really report on. I don't understand why it takes Danielson almost 7 or 8 full minutes to beat a scrub like Alan Angels, but that's also apropos of most AEW squash matches. At least they were smart enough to not have this one bleed through a commercial break. But after Danielson tapped that idiot out, he did a promo hyping up his match with Hangman Page in 2 weeks. I guess I should mention that Page was doing commentary with Shivani and Excalibur for this one. And somehow in the middle of this promo, Danielson had brought up a line how Page knows that Tony Khan prohibited both guys from touching before the title match. Funny, because I have no recollection of this going into the show, seeing as how it was never announced. But I guess that's one of those bullshit, if you didn't watch the YouTube show or exclusive interviews, you wouldn't know arguments. Anyway, so Page and Danielson confront one another on the ramp, and that's about the point where John Silver came out to act. And he tells Page that while he's not allowed to touch Danielson tonight, John Silver can touch Danielson tonight. And that's exactly what he went down to do. And just so you don't think that I'm exaggerating anything with the sexual innuendos there, I'm just quoting pretty much verbatim what John said. Gay. And because Danielson recognizes that every member of the Dark Order is beneath him, he ditches Silver in the ring and tells Page that he will meet him in 2 weeks. And I presume Silver's the guy Danielson is facing next week in Long Island. I don't know where Silver's hometown is, but I have no other explanation as to why he came out here. So that was the opening segment. And following this, we had, exactly as my notes read here, Miro in Purgatory. And apparently he now has a vision for himself. Hopefully it involves winning back the TNT Championship at some point. Up next we had Lee Moriarty versus CM Punk, which, again, was fine. MJF was out for commentary on this one, basically mocking everything Punk did throughout the entire match and making fun of the fact that he was having trouble beating Moriarty. I did get a kick out of the back and forth with Tony and MJF, with Tony calling out MJF being a horrible human being.
For them. You are a rude, terrible person.
Like I said, match was fine for what it was. Cool finish with Punk basically hoisting up Lee onto his shoulders from a reverse suplex position. And I get the premise of the CM Punk story here is that he's still rusty and he's struggling to beat undercard guys in short order. And I don't know, maybe if AEW actually had consistent short squash matches on their show with top card guys and undercard guys, it would be easier to follow. I mean, the problem is I just watched a match not less than 10 minutes ago where it took a top card guy in Bryan Danielson almost a full 10 minutes to beat an undercard guy in Alan Angels. A competitive back and forth match, mind you. So, I don't know, if you're going to do the Punk is still off his game and can't convincingly beat job guys in short order, don't you think they'd make an effort to not do this kind of story with virtually every squash match they do? I mean, they at least got it right with Wardlow later on, but this is a running theme that I constantly talk about with AEW squashes. And of course, afterwards, MJF gets on the stick and does another brief exchange with Punk, most of which consisted of him taking pot shots at Punk trying to get in Britt Baker's pants. So, unless there's an insider story that I'm missing here, I have no idea what that was about. Basically called out Punk for barely managing to beat geeks like QT Marshall and Lee Moriarty. Calls him one punk chump. Talks about the Dynamite Diamond Battle Royal that's happening next week, and I don't know, some line in there about skinning Punk's dog or something, which apparently was too much for Punk to handle, as he immediately charged his way up the ramp following that pot shot at his puppy, I guess. Yeah, it's funny. MJF calling Punk weak and a potential women-seeking creep. That's fine. But when you bring the dog into the picture, that is crossing the line. Keep in mind, we've never actually seen Punk's dog on the show and have no reason whatsoever to care about said dog, but whatever, the promo was still fine. I don't think they announced this match is happening on the 15th, so I guess they're going to lay it play out a little longer, which I'm all for. I think there might be a tendency for them to overplay the interaction between Punk and MJF if they're not careful, but as long as they don't overexpose them together on TV and they keep building up tension, I think it'll work. My worry is that if they continually have MJF and Punk do promo spouts together every week, we're going to get to a point where there's like a diminishing return with each passing promo. Because that initial exchange between Punk and MJF from last week was great. But they threw so much stuff at the wall in that one. I worry it could lessen the effect of the follow-up exchanges if they keep having these two go back and forth on the mic every week. Less is more, guys. Remember that. And, I'm saying this as someone that's actually invested in this feud and wants to see it. Anyway, up next, I'm not exactly sure what the intended match was supposed to be, but we got Adam Cole coming out to allegedly join Tony and Excalibur at the booth. And I will admit, I got a kick out of Adam Cole coming out simply to provide color commentary, but he still had to go to the ring to do his Adam Cole Bebe pose before walking back up to the booth. Cole's the fucking man. It's just too bad that things got incredibly stupid right afterwards as he sat down at the desk when who should come out but Orange Cassidy. And of course, Cassidy comes out and gets in Cole's face to do the whole pockets deal. And if that weren't insulting enough, the visual of the Beta Bucks attempting to sneak up from behind through the entrance tunnel to attack Cassidy, all the while all Cassidy has to literally do is turn his head to the right and he has a clear-cut vision of them trying to attack him from behind. That looked incredibly dumb. And the whole payoff here was Cole low-blowing Cassidy. Heel jumped in 3-on-1 until Hatchet Head and Hot Wheeler Yuta ran out for the anticlimactic save. And while the sight of seeing Chuck Taylor without a t-shirt on again is giving me the tingles, the idea of a Bucks and Cole versus Best Friends six-man is not quite as a mouth-watering visual as you would probably think it would be. Tony Nese spoke again. It was as lame as you would expect it to be. And he is facing Sammy for the TNT title on Friday. And is probably doing the clean job in his debut match, which is always what you would like to see when you're trying to establish new talent. So that's a thumbs up. Then we had Wardlow squashing a Geek in short order, which is, exactly how it needed to go. And exactly how I wish AEW would handle most of their squash matches. And Wardlow continues to get more and more over with each passing match, especially as they're putting over the whole powerbomb sequence he does. And I will admit this, I do not get a lot of entertainment out of Shawn Spears, but he has his moments. And him wailing away on a job guy with a chair after Wardlow kills him, meanwhile Wardlow's just shaking his head standing there, that was funny. Shawn Spears' Wardlow's flunky is so much more tolerable than semi-main heel Shawn Spears having boring TV matches with Cody Rhodes. So I will take it. Following that, we had a brief interview with Tony, Pentagon, and Pirate Beard Pac. And Phoenix is hurt. Shocker there. So instead of FTR facing the Lucha Bros on Rampage, it is now Pac taking Phoenix's place instead. Which honestly, at this point, I can only take as a positive, considering Pac is actually a watchable wrestler on this show. Funny though, after all these weeks of Malachi Black misting dudes in the face, Pac is the only one that's actually bothered to sell the long-term effects of it. Go figure. Here we go. My favorite TV segment of the show this week. It is Darby Allin and Sting taking on Billy and Colton Gunn. It is Streak versus Streak as they build it going in. And Up until this point in the show, I would have accurately been able to claim that the Atlanta crowd was very cold for a good chunk of the show. It's not to say that they were dead and disinterested, but like most of the reactions at this point I can merely chalk up to as golf claps. And then we got this match. And let it be known that in the year 2021, Billy Gunn and Sting, still the two biggest stars on the roster by a long shot. It's actually semi-amusing if you actually think about it. Early on in the match, you've got Darby and Colton in there, and I mean, they're just doing wrestling holds and some back and forth chain work. It's fine. Yeah, the crowd's giving them some appreciation applauses. And then Sting and Billy get tagged in. And before they even cross the ring ropes to get in the ring, these people were going ape shit. Literally, all Sting and Billy had to do was get a tag. They didn't even need to get into a stare down before people started reacting. And we wonder why modern wrestling sucks now. And, they had a nice story here with Darby playing babyface in peril and getting worked over by the heels. Sting, of course, gets the hot tag and is a house of fire. He teases the Scorpion on Billy, but Colton's in there to get the cheap shot, which the crowd was not happy about. Somewhere in that mess, Darby did one of those cannonball dives onto Colton, and I think may have legitimately landed on top of his neck. And they get the great near fall on Sting, which Colton sells perfectly. Darby did another cannonball dive onto Billy, which, I mean, I don't like seeing guys land on their heads and necks, but the flash visual of watching Darby as a human long dart on screen, it is actually kind of funny if you think about it. But Darby ends up giving Colton the stunner deal, and he falls back into Sting so he can hit the death drop for the 3. And of course, the big defining victory for the Stinger at the end of this one by getting the pin over the undefeated legend, Colton Gunn. And with any luck, that defining, shining moment will bring Sting one step closer to a future AEW World title match in 2022. Hopefully a pay-per-view main event against Danielson for the title. Maybe with any luck, Sting can be the one to dethrone Danielson and hand him his first AEW loss. Boy, can you imagine the reaction. Magical. Yeah, I love this match. Probably shouldn't have loved it as much as I did, but I mean, come on, it's Sting and Billy Gunn. They're the two biggest stars on the AEW roster. How could you not love it? So it was around this point where we had Lio Rush come out for a spiel with Team Taz. And, well, he kind of just did a promo. Said he's a fighter, and whether or not he has people watching his back, he's not going to back down. Best part of this entire thing was Taz retorting to Lio, dude, you'd better just retire. No way that wasn't a rib. And this eventually leads to Dante coming out to do the stare down with Lio before turning his back and joining up with Team Taz at the booth. And, if you can get over the fact that they sort of just leapt into this whole Dante heel turn after only having him align with Lio for something like, 3 weeks, a month at most. I mean, if you can look past that, I still advocate that this is probably the best road for Dante to go down. I just hope it doesn't turn into one of those hook case scenarios where he just kind of stands in the background and looks menacing week after week without being efficiently spotlighted. And yeah, I get the whole appeal for a guy like Hook is the fact that he just stands there and does nothing. But, that's Hook. That's kind of like his charm. But, Dante is actually someone that could be a big star. And if they want to get this guy over, which it seems like they do, they need to keep him in the foreground along with guys like Powerhouse Hobbs as the standouts of the group. And with whatever in the fuck is going on with Ricky Starks at this point, I don't even know. We had a brief skit with Jade Cargill and Thunder Rosa that probably should not have been as entertaining as it was, but Like the whole idea of Rosa ranting to Jade in Spanish while she and her manager just walk off camera, and Rosa's just standing there venting in Spanish as the camera cuts away. That was actually funny. I love Thunder Rosa on this show. And apparently she's going to provide commentary on Rampage, which, I mean, if we get more of this kind of verbiage, I'm totally down for. Then we get Chris Statlander and Ruby Soho in the Hose tournament. I like how the gimmick with Ruby on this show is the fact that Taz can't sing her theme music worth a shit. It's like, it's the most basic chorus in the world, and there's Taz on commentary singing out of time and making up his own fucking lyrics like a total dweeb. Taz is great. It definitely took a while for people to get into this thing. I actually wrote down early on, this may as well have been an empty arena match with the way the people were reacting early on. I mean, like I said earlier, the crowd was pretty bad all night, if I'm being blunt. But, you know, that really came to fruition watching the early stages of this match. And, you know, credit where it's due, they managed to get the people into this by the end once they started implementing all the false finishes. That said, it really wasn't all that good. Not that I was expecting it to be good going in, and I mean, I don't even mean that in a derisive tone, but it's like, what do you expect? Statlander's had like maybe 4 or 5 TV matches all year. She's greener than goose shit, and her dance partner is certainly not a bad wrestler or anything, but she's not fucking Kurt Angle, that's for sure. And you're like, well, I've never really dug the vibe of either girl. You know, Ruby was one of AEW's bigger female talent acquisitions in the last year, and, you know, I've always said Statlander has a great look in terms of physique, you know, even though her affiliation with Orange Cassidy does her no favors. But this just didn't click. And aside from the fact that they didn't gel at all, the bigger picture of this really goes back to what I've said about the very beginning of this TBS tournament. Why does AEW need a secondary women's title? You have 2 very good wrestlers under contract at the moment in Serena and Rosa. You have 1 solid performer with the current champion Britt. And the rest of the division is mediocre to outright lousy. And again, I know that sounds harsh, but what about it is wrong? Has there been a single good match in this tournament since the beginning? Like, I'm not even being facetious about that. I really want to know. You know, and the fact that the premise of this tournament is to crown a secondary champion, and God, it's going to be a catalyst for the women's division to have more mediocre title matches with more mediocre talent. I mean, I already get plenty of that with Britt Baker's matches. Like I said, I know it's harsh, but, you know, that's equal opportunity reviewing for you. I'm all for giving the women a platform on this show, but, you know, that doesn't mean I have to grade the segments on a curve. You want to compete on the same stage as the big boys, you got to work at that level, or as close to that level as you can possibly get. And watching sloppy, awkward, and overly choreographed matches with girls tripping over their own feet and barely pulling off spots without botches, that's the last thing I need to be seeing. Spotlight the women who are ready for prime time and keep the green talent on dark until they're ready and improved enough to be on national television. You know what? I'll say it. If that means we have to see multiple Britt Baker, Serena Deeb, and Thunder Rosa matches for the entirety of the year, so be it. I will watch 10 Serena Deeb Thunder Rosa TV matches in a year before I ever have any desire to see one botchy Chris Statlander match ever again. And that brings us to the main event. It's Andrade El Idolo taking on Cody Rhodes in a street fight. And Tony alluded it to right at the beginning during the entrances, but if there was one thing during this match that we desperately needed, it was Dusty Rhodes providing color commentary on a plunder match and uncontrollably laughing his ass off at all the garbage stupidity spots. I'll tell you, anytime I need a good laugh, I will always go back and watch that uncensored 97 street fight with Harlem Heat and Public Enemy. I remember that match like the back of my hand, and I can assure you it is not for anything that actually occurred in the match, but just listening to Dusty Rhodes and Bobby Heenan's absolute all-time classic commentary. It's just like, it's the most contagious form of comedy that you'll ever hear in your life. If you've never seen that match, go YouTube it right now, because it is on YouTube. It's like Chris D'Elia levels of comedy. There's a lot that's been said about this match, and I'll surely cover a lot of my thoughts on it in a bit, but in terms of the stuff that happened in this match, I mean, there's only so many ways I can regurgitate the term garbage outlaw match at this point. In fact, the two Cornette fans in the front row holding up the Outlaw Mud Show sign at the end, pretty much is all you need to know about this match. They had a furniture match. It was every furniture match you've ever seen. Of course, the very first thing we see at the beginning during the entrances is Andrade bringing out some type of carving knife before passing it off to Alejandro, or Abrahantes, whatever the fuck his name is. I've given up trying to figure out all these goddamn useless managers on this show. None of them ever do a fucking thing of value anyway. And by the way, I have no idea why Andre brought out a knife with him at the beginning. It never factored into the match at all, and it was a totally pointless angle. Anyway, they're doing crowd brawling, they're hitting each other with stuff left and right. Of course, no one clued in the commentary team regarding the flame retardant tape that Cody had on his back, which probably should have given away the finish right then and there, but like the announcer spent like 5 minutes pontificating about this gimmick on Cody's back, and the camera zoomed in on it at various points, which was smart. We had, God, I lost count of how many chair shots to the head we got in this match. And that wasn't even the dumbest thing involving a chair in this match. Easily the dumbest thing was Andrade going for that moonsault off the top rope and Cody pretty much hurling a chair into Andrade's face mid-dive. So many things that could have gone wrong with that. Just, why? Of course, they do the angle later on in the match where Cody goes under the ring and pulls out a sledgehammer and a golden shovel, because insecure Cody still can't get over the fact that he was never going to be a main event guy in WWE, and whatever grudge he still holds over Hunter, apparently that's not gone away after 2 years. Actually, the funniest part of this whole match was the spot toward the end. After all the shit we had seen up until this point, smashing chairs over one another's head, getting dropped on concrete, table bumps, the whole 9 yards, there's just a random point about 2/3 of the way through where Cody just picks up Andrade and hits him with a running power slam. Like, not even like a power slam onto tacks or anything. Just, all right, I'm going to pick you up now and I'm going to drop you with a move. I don't know why I laughed at that, but it was just totally absurd. And then, of course, we get the big angle that everyone's been talking about at the end. Andrade and Cody are doing very awkward stalling on the top turnbuckle while they have a table set up beneath them. And after like a minute of them waiting for Brandy's cue, she comes in under a mask, dumps lighter fluid on the table, and proceeds to set the table on fire. And that is the point where Cody gives Andrade the reverse suplex onto the table, completely overshoots Andrade over the table, which he sold anyway. After which, Cody takes the brunt of the table bump and his fucking arm is on fire as he goes to make the cover. But damn it all, it was ever so important that Cody get that long-expected babyface pop at the end of the night, right? Right. And like, I don't know. I mean, I guess my question is, Okay, let's assume for a second that the fire spot was done in large part so that Cody could get a babyface pop. Well, of course that was going to work at the end of the match as a one and done type deal to go off the air. But are we intended to be given the impression that Cody is going to get massively cheered at every venue as a result of this stupid table spot? Is he really that presumptuous to think that this one spot was enough to make him the most beloved babyface in the country? Like he's Mick Foley or something? I mean, he's not. He's still going to get vociferously booed in practically every venue he goes to. You know, they can keep re-airing replay after replay from now until the end of time, talking about how brave Cody was for putting himself through that kind of pain and the lengths he was willing to go to in order to defeat his hated foe, Andrade. I use that in quotes very loosely, by the way. It's not going to change anything about him in the long run. I mean, he might get a handful of people that jump on the bandwagon going forward, but by and large, he's still going to get immeasurably booed. I just don't get it. Yeah, I can go on to a whole other tangent about the reckless abandonment bumps in professional wrestling and how much of a turnoff it is for me watching people needlessly destroy their bodies to get cheap pops. I mean, I've been down that road countless times. It's old at this point. I mean, it really was the ultimate catalyst that got me to stop watching NXT and watching Io Shirai damn near break her neck after taking a horribly botched ladder bump on live TV. And like, the fire bumps have been overdone in wrestling for years now. They're not special anymore. They're needlessly dangerous. And unless you're one of those outlaw sadistic fucks that actually get off on watching wrestlers do this kind of crap to their bodies, I have no reason to see this kind of stuff on TV anymore. I just don't see the purpose of it. I just recapped a phenomenally worked I Quit cage match between two professionals from Starrcade 85, wherein the only, quote, dangerous thing you can maybe argue either guy did in that match was double blade. Keyword in that statement being worked. Because aside from the blade job, everything else in that match was designed to create the illusion that they were trying to hurt each other without having to actually go to such lengths as to hurt each other. It was a story-driven match that had elements of brutality without having to actually revert to shoot brutality. You know, and for those of you that didn't grow up watching those kinds of outlaw grudge matches, it is important to understand why those types of matches existed in the first place. Back when long-term storylines and feuds were actually built up as vendetta and grudge matches, the reason you would get I Quit cage matches was because guys had a blood feud so deep and so personal that the only way to settle it was to contest it under no DQ, anything go rules stipulation matches. The idea and the selling point being someone might die, but in order to settle the feud, that's what both men are willing to go to get to that point. You don't get those kinds of matches now. Nowadays, you get street fights and cage matches because guys that wrestle one another on several different occasions need some kind of gimmick or hook so that it doesn't come across like, you know, WWE's way of doing rematches where it's the same bullshit over and over again every week. It never feels warranted. Let me ask you this, and I want you to be honest. Has the Andrade-Cody feud been so personal and so deep that it warranted these guys having a crash dummy street fight on TV with a flaming table spot? No, of course not. They've been feuding for a fucking month. They had one TV match with a fucked finish where the heel won. And all of a sudden they're trying to hype this up as a Starrcade semi-main with two guys that have a brewing blood feud? What brewing blood feud? This has not been a year-long struggle with Cody trying to beat Andrade. This is not a scenario of Andrade costing Cody a title shot at a big pay-per-view or trying to take out his brother. Or, honestly, he really didn't do anything all that dastardly. They just flip-flop programs with Cody, Malachi, Pac, and Andrade because the greatest booker in all of the land couldn't figure out what to fucking do with them. So everything about this was just stupid from the onset. And I already cringed at the umpteen dozen chair shots to the head I saw in this match, but the fire spot at the end just put this over the edge for me. And I'll at least credit the mainstream outlets that cover AEW. As clear and evident as it is at this point that most of these platforms are unashamedly in the tank for AEW, at least some of them had the balls to come out and call out the BS of that main event finish, because they knew it was bullshit. And, I already wasn't feeling this episode to begin with, but that flaming table bump just pretty much sealed the deal on this one for me. And like I mentioned, the visual of both guys lying in the middle of the ring with the burning table, all the while you got the Cornette fan in the front row with the Outlaw Mud Show sign. It's very fitting for everything you need to know about that main event. The rest of the show, there were periods of ebb and flow, but generally I didn't get a whole lot out of this one. I love the Sting Darby versus Gun Club match for my own sadistic pleasure, and I am looking forward to the Paige Danielson title match, and I like the continual direction they're going with Punk and MJF. I just hope it doesn't overstay its welcome. But the Elite Best Friends stuff is a no-go for me. The TBS tournament has been a total bust. And most of the promos and interviews this week were blasé. Main event, I already said my piece on that. I guess at this point, the commonality we can most agree upon, still better than Raw. And moving on with the show here, that brings us to NWA World Championship Wrestling from November 30th of the year 1985. And this was the post-Starrcade event, or show. And it was interesting because within the first 20 or so minutes of the show, we were kind of being given the impression that a lot of it was essentially going to be a recap of the pay-per-view, which, by the way, if you want my full thoughts on the pay-per-view, you can go watch my podcast from Monday where we discussed the pay-per-view in full length. And it definitely started out as a recap show, but did not quite delve into as much as the featured content of the pay-per-view as I probably would have expected. Audio was terrible for this show, by the way. First thing they show were highlights of the Sam Houston Crusher Khrushchev Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight title match, which again, go check out my Starrcade report if you want a detailed analysis of that match, including the very interesting backstory as to how the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight title was vacated in the lead-in to that match. Coming back from the break, they recap the Terry Taylor-Buddy Landell National Heavyweight title match. That finish is still fantastic, by the way. I guess, well, the one thing I did jot down here that I thought was kind of interesting, we have definitely seen pay-per-view match recaps throughout wrestling history, and to an extent, we've seen various promotions go to such lengths as to air good portions of the match for free on TV. I guess I just found it interesting that they essentially replayed these matches for free right after the pay-per-view. And it wasn't like they only showed maybe like the last minute or so of the match. Like in the case of the Houston Khrushchev match, they aired a good 2/3 of that match in full. I don't know. Maybe figuring those two were the lesser hype matches going into the show, so maybe they figured it wasn't going to hurt future VHS sales. And yes, I did just use the word VHS. Most of you Gen Z folk out there don't even know what a VHS is, much less even know what it looks like. Y'all remember the classic days of the tape rewinder, where you actually had to go out of your way to sit and wait for a tape to rewind itself to the beginning if you actually wanted to watch something? Good times. So then we got the Midnight Express, which I think this might actually be the first Midnight Express match I've reviewed on the Superstation show since we started doing these recaps. Anyway, it is Condrey and Eaton taking on Rocky King, who I inadvertently referred to in my notes here as Rodney King, and the Italian Stallion. And we had Cornette providing what I can merely define as stellar color commentary. And I guess I'll go ahead and throw this out there since we've not gotten too much of a chance to talk about the Midnight Express in length on this show. You know, excluding that god-awful Street Fight from the Starrcade pay-per-view, which we'll just pretend didn't exist. You know, growing up as a kid, my brother had a lot of these shows taped. And, you know, when he would come over to the house, we'd hang out together and we'd watch a lot of these shows together. And I have no idea why, but one of my earliest memories of hanging around the house with my brother watching these shows would be him listening to Jim Cornette, and he would just be sitting there cracking up during his promos. And like sometimes my dad would be there too in the room laughing along too. Of course, I'm probably, oh God, I don't even remember. I mean, most of the jokes here are soaring way over my head at the time anyway, but I was maybe 5 or 6 at the time. But, you know, as I got older and I went back to watch some of these classic interviews and tapes, it made so much more sense to me why everyone used to get a kick out of anything on the show featuring Cornette and the Midnight Express. And I guess you could say I was a very unconventional wrestling fan growing up. For me, nothing was ever black and white with me in wrestling. I was never your standard traditional fan of, you know, boo the heels, cheer the faces. You know, a lot of cases there were very few baby faces as a kid that I would actually consider I naturally gravitated toward. You know, especially watching the territories. To be blunt, I thought a lot of them were boring. You know, obviously I was a big fan of Dusty, but honestly, I don't think it was until probably Sting came around into the picture around 87, 88, whenever that time frame was, that I would classify as like another babyface that I genuinely loved watching consistently. I was always infatuated with the compelling characters, you know, which is probably why it took until the year 1990 for me to actually discern what I would classify as my favorite wrestler of all time in The Undertaker. I mean, I didn't give a damn that Taker was supposed to be a heel. I just thought he was one of the most ominous and compelling characters in wrestling that I had ever seen up until that point. I mean, it was that point where I was still young enough to buy the whole supernatural persona is legit. And, you know, because he was doing things that had never been seen before in the business, like the whole ambiance and the whole presentation always captured my attention. But getting back to the corny thing in the Midnight Express thing for a minute, I never saw them in the old-fashioned manner that a lot of casual fans saw them at the time. You know, like the quintessential loudmouth manager working with the two cocky, arrogant dudes in the tag team. Like, I just saw a funny, over-the-top cartoon manager with goofy glasses and outfits and two phenomenal in-ring technicians doing great wrestling matches. And I was able to decipher that around age, I don't know, 7, 8. Like I said, I was a very weird wrestling fan. Kind of indescribable in a lot of ways. Just very unconventional and different from what you would expect out of a young child growing up watching the product. But, you know, going into 86, we're going to be seeing a lot more Midnight Express on the Superstation, so strap in for more Cornette wackiness. God, this match was so entertaining, though. I love that one of the main stories throughout the match is Cornette constantly referring to the Italian Stallion putting on weight.
He's fat!
And, you know, of course, the entirety of it, Cornette's pacing back and forth between ringside and the announcer's desk so he could ream Schiavone and Crockett. Just great heel stuff. You know, and honestly, what more can be said about Condrey and Eaton working together? Everything they ever did as a team is just one fluid motion from bell to bell. You know, another duo that I wish modern tag teams other than FTR would actually watch and study. You know, there's a reason FTR is probably the best, quote, technical tag team in the business today, and I can assure you it does not come from watching fucking AAA tag matches. But the finish to this match is Condrey spiking Rocky with a brainbuster on the mat for the 3. of which I actually needed to watch a replay to convince myself that Rocky was not actually dropped full force on top of his cranium. As it turns out, Dennis Condrey is just a fantastic worker and knows how to give someone a compelling-looking brainbuster. And after this, we had Billy Jack Haynes out for a promo with Tony. And the best way I think I could sum up the entirety of this promo is something to the extent of the following. Billy Jack teased a bunch of future matches and programs that never came to fruition because he got ousted from Jim Crockett Promotions within the next couple weeks, never to be seen on the show again. That is an exact quote that I wrote down. And that is not kayfabe, anyone. That is a shoot. For those of you that don't know the story, I guess I should put an asterisk next to this because, you know, whenever you're going back and reading a lot of these stories, there's always some kind of portion that gets exaggerated or distorted in some manner. But from what I've gathered from various sources, the story goes something like this. Billy Jack had gotten into an altercation with Jim Crockett that apparently got physical, and to what extent that physicality reached, we're not exactly sure. But they do apparently lead into a program with him and the Barbarian in the coming weeks. And, I mean, we'll find out what happens as the review continues here, but I presume it gets abruptly dropped. Because by the time we get to the end of the year, Billy Haynes is gone. And it's very unfortunate, but to tell you the truth, it's not something out of the ordinary of what we regularly used to see around this time in the business. In fact, a very similar dilemma comes up with Buddy Landel in the coming weeks. It's hilarious, too, because based on the description I just presented regarding Billy Jack Haynes, you'd probably get the impression that this dude was a cold-blooded prick. Meanwhile, he comes out for this promo with Shivani. It's just the most unorthodox thing you'd ever come to expect out of a Billy Jack Haynes promo. He's this beef, jacked up dude that looks like he'd tear your head off with one snap. And he's the biggest teddy bear in the world on this show. He's the most down-to-earth, kind-hearted individual who just wants to wrestle the best in the world, and he's just happy to be on the show in front of all the warm and loving fans. Just a nice family man saying hi to his folks in Oregon, blowing kisses to his dad, which is kind of weird, but all right. It's just like, it's totally out of the realm of what you would expect a Billy Jack Haynes promo to sound like. Up next, we had the Raging Bull Manny Fernandez taking on Tommy Lane. Not a whole lot to it. I did get a kick out of the single woman in the crowd chanting "Let's go Tommy" throughout the entirety of this match. I don't know, could have been a relative or something, but whoever it was, she desperately wanted Tommy Lane to win this match by hook or by crook. And it was also interesting here, too, because aside from the one female Tommy Lane fan in the crowd, there were still a handful of people that were audibly booing Manny. And while I wouldn't make the argument that he worked this match as a heel, he also didn't wrestle like a traditional babyface. Now, spoiler alert for something way down the road, but I know Fernandez does eventually turn heel in '86. So maybe this was sort of a way for them to tease the idea, but not go all the way with it. It just, I don't know. I didn't expect them to tease it so early on, I guess. Anyway, he did a post-match promo to basically confirm that '86 will be the year of the bull. And most of it was in Spanish, so I didn't write a whole lot down. That brings us to our Championship Challenge Series match, featuring the Road Warriors taking on Black Bart and Thunderfoot. It's funny, I read somewhere, I don't even know where I found this. I was just perusing through some old archived reports on these NWA shows around this time. Someone had commented on the Championship Challenge Series deal and made some remark about how it's comedic that the majority of these matches were never actual championship matches. I mean, which is kind of amusing if you think about it, especially with considering how many goddamn belts were around during this period. But this whole thing here eventually built to an angle where Ivan Koloff came out to run down Hawk and Animal at the booth. That led to Paul Ellering coming over to get in Ivan's face and call out the Russians. And he eventually got jumped behind by Nikita and Khrushchev. Hawk tried to come over and make the save, but he got thwarted by the heels and laid out momentarily. And after Animal rolled up one of the jobbers for the fastest 3 count in the history of wrestling, the Russians all jumped Animal in the ring and laid him out, which the announcers did a great job selling as a big deal, because basically they were pointing out the fact that the Road Warriors have never been in this vulnerable and defenseless position in their entire careers. And the whole thing concludes with them carrying Ellering off set. So it was a cool angle. More to come on it later in the show. I guess I should point out, the match was very clunky and messy, which, you kind of come to expect out of the Road Warriors. They were not particularly known for their prodigious in-ring ability. Still better than Chronic. But this all led to a deal after the break where Jim Crockett came out to lay down some of the new ground rules for the Championship Challenge Series. He says that all matches now must have a decisive winner, so they will be contested under no DQ, no countout rules. And if matches do go to a time limit draw, they will take a brief rest period and restart the match until there is a winner. Which, immediately upon hearing this, I just wrote down a very simple question. Why not just make the matches no time limits? Wouldn't that be easier? But he hyped up next week's Championship Series match, which is Ole Arn and Tully taking on Magnum TA, Billy Jack Haynes, and Sam Houston. Poor Magnum. Kind of got shacked on that one. Then we had Miss Atlanta Lively taking on Jim Jeffers. Ronnie Garvin. Speaking of baby faces I found relatively boring as a kid. It is going to be interesting. And I'm sure looking back with modern eyes, I will come to grow and appreciate Ronnie more as I, keep moving along the archives here, because he does become more of a key player on this show. But, Ronnie was another one of those up-and-coming groomed baby faces around this time, and even as a kid, it was always hard for me to get behind him. Part of that could be the fact that Ron never wrestled and carried himself like a traditional babyface, and his promos were never all that good from what I remember either. But, like I said, hindsight is 20/20, and the things we remember from young ages are typically never seen the same way through modern lenses as we get older, so who knows, maybe I'll get a different perception of Ronnie as we move along through these shows, but it is interesting looking back at that. I did get a kick out of the finish here, where after Ron decks Jeffers with a knockout punch and he sits on top of his chest to pin him, right before they cut to the replay, you catch a brief frame where Ronnie just paintbrushes Jeffers in the face. What a fucking douche. Anyway, we got the Road Warriors back out for a promo, and boy, are they pissed. I can only imagine what it would have been like as part of the production team around this point, just listening to off-the-cuff raging Road Warriors promos. Probably had someone in the back going, guys, just keep your finger on that censor button in case things go completely off the rails in a hurry. It's like watching a Scott Steiner promo. And in the most PG paraphrase of this promo, here's what I wrote down. The Road Warriors vow to kill the Russians. And they also hate Russia. Oh, and I should also point out that Hawk and Animal nearly demolished Tony to try to get possession of the microphone. And if you catch the last shot of the segment before they cut the commercial, Tony Schiavone's facial expression. That is all I will say about it. So at this point in the show, they took some time to address the TV title situation, and they brought out Arn Anderson to the booth to share his side of the story with the ongoing issue between him and Dusty over the belt. And for those of you that don't recall, The story pretty much goes Arn and Ole kicked out a crutch from underneath Dusty during a taped interview, and they basically stole his TV title. And Arn basically had possession of the belt right up until about the point of a recent interview where Arn was doing something with Bob Caudle on Mid-Atlantic TV, and Dusty comes in from behind, decks Arn over the head with a chair in the most Looney Tunes manner imaginable, after which Dusty took back the TV title and walked off set in the most casual and coolest manner possible, and Arn's just laying on the ground selling. It was a glorious bump and one that I watched over and over again laughing at. But that led to where we are on this show. Arn's claim is that he has the best win-loss record on the TV show. He wrestles more times on television than Dusty does in an entire year. By all accounts, he is the unclaimed TV champion. And they take a minute to show some footage of him introducing his Gorebuster finisher. But, they announced after the break, but this all set up a tournament that they're going to be doing on the January 4th show in Greensboro to crown the Real World's television champion. Man, January 4th has a very interesting date stamp in the wrestling archives. Wasn't January 4th the TNA show where Hogan and Bischoff debuted and they thought they were going to beat Raw in the ratings or something like that? I think, didn't they debut a bunch of former WWE guys on that show too? Oh, God! I just remembered. Yeah. That was the show. Because I remember that was the show where Jeff Hardy debuted. It was during that match where they had that red bird cage with all the X Division guys and Homicide couldn't get out of the fucking cage for like 10 minutes, so they had to improvise a finish. Live TV, folks. God, I miss the old TNA. So much god-awful programming every week, but it was always so entertaining to just rip that show apart and rant about how terrible it was. In a way, I would say it was more entertaining than ranting about how bad WCW was by the end. What were we talking about? Totally forgot. Oh, yeah, that's right. I brought up the January 4th date. Anyway, moving along here. We're almost done with the show. Last thing they touched on was the Tully Dusty cage match from the Great American Bash earlier in the year where Dusty had won the TV title. And again, they showed the last couple or so minutes of the match, and including one of the nastiest looking top rope elbow bumps I think I've ever seen in my life from Dusty. And I went back and watched it again just to see exactly what in the hell was supposed to happen there. Honestly, it looked like a miscue to me. Because Tully and Dusty are fighting on the top rope, and Dusty gives Tully an elbow to the forehead so that he can take the back bump. And as he's laying there in dead man's position, Dusty comes flying off the top rope for a diving elbow, and like he clearly makes contact with Tully on the landing, but like Tully tried to move out of the way, but he couldn't get out of the way in time, so Dusty kind of makes partial contact on Tully while the majority of his body just kind of splats on the ring mat. Did not look fun. But the finishing sequence of that match was Baby Doll trying to hand Tully the loaded arm pad through the side of the cage while the ref was down, but Dusty thwarts him, gives him a pile driver, which Baby Doll absolutely sells perfectly with her distraught panic on the outside. And of course, Dusty pins Tully, crowd goes crazy, and that was basically how the show went off air. And I wrote this down because I thought it was kind of ironic. This is the second show that the lasting image of the program is Dusty holding up a championship title. But then the reality immediately sets in. We're a couple days removed from the Starrcade 85 event where Dusty just won the World Heavyweight title when he pinned Flair in the middle of the ring clean as a sheet. And there is zero mention of it on the program at all. No replay, no footage of the match, no promo from Dusty or Flair on the match or on the show to talk about it. But we do get a visual of Dusty holding up the TV title before the end of the night. And again, some of that has to do with the formatting of the taping schedule, but it was a very strange takeaway from the show. All in all, though, it was a fine show. The transition of unexpected roster rotation is going to get a little fuzzy in the next couple weeks, but it was still an enjoyable sit-through. The Road Warriors Russians angle is very basic, but I think one of the reasons it stands out as a gem on the show is the fact that, unlike in the business today where every wrestling show has to have 75 goddamn heat angles in a given night, this show had one. That's probably why it stood out. And obviously the Midnight Express Jim Cornette stuff was awesome and a great harbinger of things to come in '86 for them. I don't know how much more time they spend on the Starrcade recap, but I can only presume that the next show is going to have a little more in-depth discussion of some of the featured content. Because aside from the zero mention of the Dusty Flair main event, they also didn't cover anything regarding the Rock and Roll Russians cage match or the I Quit cage match with Tully and Magnum. They aired some post-match interview stuff with Magnum and Weaver, but nothing in terms of footage or match discussion. So, guess we'll see what they have in store for next week. And that brings us to the December 4th, 1982 edition of World Class Championship Wrestling. And our first match of the show is Roberto Renesto taking on the supposed returning Spoiler, who had been taken off of television for a period of time, a former affiliate of Gary Hart and H&H Enterprises, which kind of seems like it's a running theme on this show around this time, where H&H is sort of deteriorating from within, with members just slowly fizzling out of the group altogether. And they played that more up with Bundy later on in the show. Anyway, this was a match. Actually, I think Bill Mercer summed it up pretty good on commentary. He said, almost a direct quote here, "Spoiler is not pretty to watch in the ring." Yeah, I wouldn't dispute that. Ah, shoot, where's my Steve Austin drop? Do I have that one queued up? Oh, yeah, here it is. It was funny, though, because, a good chunk of the story in this match was Spoiler doing the typical heel trope where, he has the job guy beat, but he, pulls the guy's shoulders off the mat before the ref counts 3. All the while, there's a good portion of the crowd that was visibly cheering Spoiler throughout the match. Gotta love the Dallas crowd. So, that was that match. And Spoiler won, in case you needed further clarification on that. Oh boy. Here's something that I was not expecting to ever talk about in wrestling ever again. It's time for midgets. Am I allowed to say that on YouTube? No, whatever. It's not gonna monetized anyway. It's funny because, obviously growing up as a kid, I never got the appeal of midget wrestling, and more often than not, it was never really geared toward me just based on the kind of wrestling fan that I evolved into over time. The one thing that needs to be said, and I think a lot of people forget about this form of wrestling, it was a draw at one point. Especially around the early to mid-50s when you started seeing bookers and promoters implementing these kinds of matches on their cards. And obviously, as is the case, we had seen bleeding through the 70s, and it eventually gravitated its way toward the WWF by the early to mid-80s. Vince started booking midgets on the cards on some of the more marquee shows. Pretty sure one of the featured matches on the WrestleMania 3 card included a midgets match. But this was something that we would see sporadically over time in multiple territories. I think we'd see it carry over in WCW in the mid to late 90s. It even carried over in WWE well into the early to mid 2000s. And yes, there was always controversy over the presentation of it. especially by the time you got to the 90s and you had organizations like the LPA speaking out against the political incorrectness of midget wrestling and showing their disdain for its treatment of essentially making midgets feel like side pieces or stunt show performers, which, I'm sorry if it sounds derogatory on the surface, but duh. If you know anything about wrestling history and the presentation of midget wrestling, of course it was a sideshow. That was the point. It was an attraction showcase for casual mainstream fans. Like, it was supposed to be a fun form of comedy. Like, not in a pejorative way to demean little people, but that was the selling point. Now, I'll grant you, Vince and the WWF got way too cheeky with midget wrestling by the time you got to the early to mid-90s. Especially once you started introducing characters like, God, remember Dink the Clown and the Lawler minis and all that hot garbage? And yeah, most of that sucked. But the premise of this art form of wrestling around this time was to use it as an attraction source for casual fans. And trust me when I tell you, the same people that would constantly claim that midget wrestling was offensive and demeaning, probably the same people that popped for mud wrestling matches and bikini contests back in the heyday. So, grow up and get over yourselves. And obviously with the nature of the business today and the whole scope of our political system, this clearly wouldn't fly today. And nowadays you'd have LPA protesting and campaigning to shut down WWE and every major organization in the country that tries to feature this kind of wrestling on a mainstream outlet. And that's political correctness for you. Anyway, this one featured Shorty C taking on Tiny Tim. I'm just kidding. It was Little Coco taking on Hillbilly Pete. And I'll say this, gotta give credit where it's due. The people were more into this thing than the opener. And, I still look at these guys as more credible athletes over anything I've ever seen Marco Stunt do. So, thumbs up to that. The funny thing, too, is if you actually go back and watch this match in full... See, here's a problem I didn't mention earlier, too, but this is also an important note. I think modern fans are very misconstrued when they look back at the history of midget wrestling. Because in a lot of ways, modern wrestling fans grew up watching midget wrestling on television. The first thing they relate to with this kind of form of wrestling is Vince and the WWF. The first thing they think of are the Lawler minis, and the Dink the Clowns, and the Hornswoggles, and the goofy, hokey delivery of the way midgets were portrayed as characters on television around that time. So, if you don't have any other context to what old school midget wrestling actually looked like, you have a very distorted frame of reference. This was not a WWF midget match. These were two small guys that had an athletic back and forth match. They did chain wrestling. They used basics and fundamentals. There was a clear-cut face and a clear-cut heel. They didn't do any cartoon comedy. They played it straight. So, while I think a lot of modern fans would take one look at this and be immediately desensitized to it, it is important to establish that midget wrestling was not always supposed to be intended slapstick. And granted, it was never going to be like a top-of-the-card attraction for a pay-per-view, but it did have a place in the business at one point. So there's your little history lesson there. Anyway, Coco got the win after hitting a flying headbutt. And of all things in this match that could possibly have given me a chuckle, with all the apparent jokes and all, the most blunt statement of the entire segment. Winner at 5 minutes and 17 seconds, Little Coco, the midget. Just in case you couldn't tell. Well, just when you think things couldn't get any wackier on this week's edition of World Class, that brings us to this segment with Bill Mercer and the Von Erichs going duck hunting.
Rabbit fever! Duck season! Rabbit fever! Duck season! Rabbit fever! Rabbit season! Duck fever! Rabbit season! I say it's duck season, and I say fire!
Yeah, too easy. I know. I don't know. There was just something unexplainably real about everything that occurred in this segment. Whether it was the nature of the country boys spending a day going out hunting, whether it was Kevin Von Erich hanging out with Bill Mercer and talking about how he'd rather spend his days out in the countryside in nature instead of being in the crowded city surrounded by all the noise and activity. Whether it was the unintentional hilarity of seeing all four guys walking off together, each holding a dead duck in hand. It was just so unlike any pre-tape you see in the business today. Like, it really was a Von Erich home video, plain as day, without any overlaid music or graphic footage. There was no WWE or AEW element to try and dress the presentation of this up or anything. It was, let's get the film crew together and shoot a segment with Mercer and the Von Erichs going on your average, everyday hunting spree. And it was the most cut and dry thing you could possibly imagine. I loved everything about this skit. After this, we had the Great Kabuki taking on Al Madrill. Certainly better than the previous Al Madrill match I reviewed last week, that's for sure. Although I will point out a notable spot in this match where Madrill had Kabuki in... I don't even know if you could classify this as an arm wringer. He just kind of held onto Kabuki's arm and allegedly wrenched it, although it did not look all that convincing. Although he's constantly shouting for the ref to ask Kabuki if he's had enough yet. Things definitely picked up toward the end. Madrill even did a flying crossbody to the floor on Kabuki, which, I mean, in 1982 was almost like watching someone do a reverse 450 splash through 6 tables today and still being able to kick out at 1. But that got a pretty substantial pop, as you might expect. And the big spot at the end was Madrill going for the running knee in the corner, but Kabuki dodged it. Madrill rammed his knee into the turnbuckle pad, and then Kabuki did a series of elbow smashes to Madrill during a replay, mind you. And as they're showing the replay, with Madrill missing the running knee in the corner, you just hear the bell ring, presumably with the ref stopping the match and awarding Kabuki the win. Although looking back, it might also have been possible that it was a count-out win. Before they cut away to the break, you could hear Madrill arguing with the ref and saying, "I thought I got up in time." So it is possible that the ref just counted him out. But that was some very odd camera work. And the main event for the show was Kerry Von Erich and Brian Diaz taking on Checkmate and the Dragon. Another unintentional bit of comedy for this show. Just some of that old territorial humor that probably is not supposed to come across as funny, but like the delivery is just so much funnier as intended. So Mercer's doing a pre-match interview with Kerry and Brian before the match, and Kerry starts doing a spiel about how him and Brian were doing some training before the show. And like I'm paraphrasing some of the verbiage, but he essentially said something to the extent of the following: "We just got out of the gym a little while ago, practiced some moves together, and we're going to try some stuff in the ring, and if we fail, we fail, but if we succeed, hopefully we win." I don't know why I thought that was so funny, but probably more so has to do with just like the low-key delivery of Kerry's intonation. He's basically like, we might win, we might lose, who knows? Fuck it, who cares? It's like a Rob Van Dam promo minus the weed and the fact that Kerry Von Erich is actually a good wrestler and a likable personality. Oops, did I say that out loud? Sorry. Spoiler alert, people. They lost. Guess I should point out, too, that before the bell, King Kong Bundy came out to inform the people that he was able to get out of his contract with H&H Enterprises and that he is now his own independent man going forward. And his new organization is now referred to as Devastation Inc. An omen of things to come. The match was not all that good, but goddamn was Kerry going to try to carry it to something semi-passable. And I've said this about Ric Flair too, man. It's probably why I've always respected him more often than not, even through all the trials and tribulations of his life. But the Von Erichs had so much in common with Flair in terms of work rate. It didn't matter if they were wrestling in the main event of Starrcade or having a shitty squash match on TV. When they were scheduled to work, they fucking worked. Kerry's in there with 3 other guys tripping over their own feet, stumbling and fumbling around the ring. But he's in there working body parts, getting the crowd invested. I don't remember much about Bryan's career other than the fact that he trained under Fritz and worked with the Von Erichs a lot during the course of his career. But the finish here, where things breaking down at the end with all 4 guys, ref ends up taking Kerry and trying to get him back to his corner. And that is when the heels hit a double team slam on Bryan from behind. I think it was Checkmate that got the pin. After which fans immediately started filing out of the building. So they were either really pissed about this finish or maybe the bell sounded for lunch. I don't know. A lot of wackiness on the show this week, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. If anything, I appreciated the fact that we mostly got decisive finishes this week, even if some of them weren't clean finishes per se. Didn't get a whole lot in terms of story advancement at the top of the card, but the Bundy story got some follow-up, and they're still building the Kerry Flair showdown for the end of the year. So, like I said, kind of a modicum of variety on the show this week, but again, an enjoyable 45-minute watch. Guys, if you want to follow FSW, our content in the future, and support the channel, make sure you smash the subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment down below on any or all subjects discussed today. As always, I appreciate the support, and if you enjoy the Retro Series content, you can stop by each Friday as we delve through the archives of the NWA World Championship Wrestling and World Class Library. Until Monday's episode, where we cover Rampage, NWA, and my next article entry discussion, that'll pretty much cover everything for Monday's topics. So take care, everyone. Peace out.